Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. This is the Bible Forum. It's Sunday, December 3rd, 2017. Unless you've been living in a van down by the river, you have recognized the fact that America is changed. It's not what it was 50 years ago. If you're over the age of 60, you've probably noticed it. You may have noticed even if you're only in your 50s. If your family was still rooted in something close to traditional values as you were growing up. Why? Well, because something changed in America. And it changed in the 1960s. Something that had been brewing since the early 20th century. It's called liberalism. Historians, when they chronicle the rise of liberalism, political liberalism, social liberalism, they start with Germany in the mid-19th century. They follow it through Great Britain about the turn of the century, and they identify it here by the mid-20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s. Socially, we had flappers and we had jitterbugging, we had pole sitting, we had jazz. Politically, we had Teddy Roosevelt, who ran the second time for president under the progressive banner. That kind of progressivism, although he didn't get elected, but that kind of progressivism that existed is pretty much what kicked us into the Great Depression. Liberals will tell you, never let a disaster go to waste. Out of that, we got Social Security, a host of government programs to run all sorts of areas of our society. You already had the income tax back in 1916, but a family had to earn more than $4,000 a year in order to pay any of that tax, unless they had a business or they had real estate that they'd sold or that sort of thing. It's hard to imagine most people earning more than $80 a week in 1916, and that's what it would take. And $80 doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but today that would be over $93,000. No taxes until you reach that level. Then came World War I. We got into that one late. It was followed by what some consider an artificial depression, followed by another world war. And all of these events kept the family fairly tight, holding on to what values they had. But after World War II, there was a boom in business, in wages, and eventually in children. Ordinary wage earners could now buy homes under the GI Bill. Levitt towns everywhere in the country, huge tracts of land with houses dotting the landscape. By 1950, most wage earners had a car, unheard of before that. And then came television. And with television, the world opened up to all of us. Dads home from the war and clearly behind the curve due to the Great Depression were working and trying to give their families what they, fathers, parents, never had. You do realize the greatest generation endured great deprivation. And at the time when they were starting to get their life together as adults, a war came along and they had to put everything on hold and go to Europe or Japan, wherever, and fight the war. They learned a lot of character. When they came home, they really wanted to get busy. They had a lot to catch up on. And during the 1960s, the old values, well, 50s really, the values were starting to give way to new values. In the 1960s, life for most people was good. They paid little or no attention to what the stock market was doing or the value of the dollar. They worked. They sent their kids to college. And they retired in relative ease, sometimes in the 1980s. They'd done their part. Now it was the kids' responsibility. The America we live in today is not at all like it was in my grandparents' or my parents' day. It's not at all like it was in 1967. 50 years ago, the Beatles were changing our music. Vietnam was changing our worldview. Marriage was on the way out, and abortion on demand was right around the corner. Teenagers were largely starting to raise themselves, both parents working, and enough media and music to keep them occupied. But things did not stop there. They never do. The generation that found themselves largely ignored exploded with their own culture. It began somewhere in the late 1960s and grew up in the 1970s and 80s. By the 1990s, young people were hardly recognizable in 1950s terms. They did not simply have more technology, they actually thought differently. And their worldview was totally different. Researchers William Strauss and Neil Hauer coined the term millennial to describe people born in America between 1982 and 2004. This group thinks in ways no generation ever has. And they have far more technology at their fingertips than any human being has ever had, giving them a view of the world that no human being has ever had. But that view of the world is not real. Of course, you can't convince them of that. In their minds, their world is the only one that makes sense. Where do they get that idea? From the media. From their school teachers. Why did they just simply accept this? Largely due to the lack of parental involvement. Their parents had been busy working. Kids pretty much were fending for themselves. The parents did not have the power over the children to shape their culture as my parents had and as I had with my children. Parents who had been conditioned by the sexual revolution and the hippie generation were not anything like the greatest generation. And as they say, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. The 60s brought us some of the worst so-called music known to mankind. It was loud, it was raucous, drug and sex-laced, with a fair share of violence. Vietnam, the government refused to call it a war, changed many men and women forever. Those who were not damaged by it physically or emotionally were now rooted in activism. They found expression in the effort of black people to gain equality. The overt limitations were only active in the South, where Democrats held sway and where slavery had once bloomed. Devoid of any informed opinion, these young people gravitated to the liberal side, assuming it was they who cared most about black folks and about freedom. Was it not a Southern liberal Democrat president who was responsible for the Great Society legislation? Lyndon Baines Johnson. They never paid enough attention to realize that that one piece of legislation did more to enslave and corrupt the black family than all the Jim Crow laws in the world. They were never told it was the liberal Democrats that kept black folks down all those years. And the Democrats have done a wonderful job building off of this lie. So as a result of the 60s, we have a generation that did not understand the world, did not understand the word no, did not have to limit their sexual appetites. They could have sex and they could take a pill. Later they could have abortion on demand. They didn't have to wait for anything. They had largely never worked for anything in their life. They had instant access to the world and to all of its excesses. They had their own music, their own culture. They had their own language, their own fashions. They watched and listened to all sorts of opinions and value systems. They rejected their grandparents' Protestant work ethic and lost themselves in the noise that is contemporary rock. In short, they tuned in and dropped out. So how did they do? Well, of their children, fewer and fewer are getting married. More and more women are in the job market at all levels. Familiarity breeds contempt, meaning less respect for one another. It also provides opportunity. If you want to get ahead, please the boss. Of course, that works both ways, male and female. Why? Because the core value system was gone, not even a memory. Now it's all about whether you get caught. 50 years ago, it was about integrity, and it was about the watchful eyes of God. Not to mention the law of cause and effect. But all that was abandoned with the baby boomers, and it's now their children who are reaping this so-called reward. When it comes to these men who are women coming out into the media and with lawyers and talking about them, telling on them, I say look for more of them to show up and speak up. The dam has broken. It's open season. Look for more men to pay the price, men you would not have expected. And note how many of these men have a liberal worldview.